Welcome back to SNK and Company. Today I'm taking you through one of the most consequential tax judgments in India's recent legal history, the Supreme Court's ruling on the Tiger Global International Holdings and their multi-billion-dollar Flipkart exit. This is a case that not only decided whether a specific investment deal should be taxed, but has fundamentally reshaped how India views cross-border tax planning, treaty benefits, and anti-avoidance law. What the Supreme Court decided, why it did so, and what lies ahead for foreign investors, private equity funds, global M&A, and India's tax certainty are all parts of this complex story that I will unpack for you in simple, detailed language. The saga begins with Walmart's acquisition of Flipkart in 2018. Flipkart, one of India's largest e-commerce companies, was bought by the U.S. retail giant Walmart in a deal valued at around $16 billion. Tiger Global, a prominent global investment firm, had invested in Flipkart through intermediate entities incorporated in Mauritius. These Mauritius-based companies, established long before the deal and holding category-wide global business licenses, sold their shares in Flipkart Singapore to a Luxembourg buyer as part of the Walmart transaction. Under the India-Mauritius Double Taxation Avoidance Agreement and its grandfathering provisions for investments made before April 2017, Tiger Global argued that the capital gains arising on this sale should be exempt from Indian tax. They also pointed to valid tax residency certificates issued by the Mauritian authorities as evidence of genuine residence and entitlement to treaty benefits. But Indian tax authorities saw the matter very differently. The Income Tax Department believed that Tiger Global's structure was designed essentially as a conduit to access treaty benefits and avoid Indian tax on significant capital gains that were, in substance, derived from assets located in India. The department argued that the Mauritius entities lacked independent commercial substance, that much of the decision-making and control lay outside Mauritius, particularly in the United States, and that the arrangement as a whole was a tax avoidance device rather than a bona fide investment route. They therefore refused to issue a nil withholding tax certificate and instead applied withholding taxes at source on the transaction. The legal fight that followed took several turns. Tiger Global first approached the Authority for Advance Rulings, which is a statutory body in India that can give advance opinions on taxability. In this case, the AAR examined the structure and sided with the revenue's view, finding that there was prima facie evidence of tax avoidance based on how the arrangement was structured. That ruling alone created significant uncertainty for the investor group. This ruling was then taken to the Delhi High Court, which reversed the AAR's position and found in favor of Tiger Global. The High Court ruled that the Mauritius entities with valid tax residency certificates and substantive governance structures were entitled to treaty benefits. It also held that grandfathering protections applied to the pre-2017 investments. At that stage, Tiger Global's position seemed secure. However, the department appealed to the Supreme Court of India, the final arbiter in the land, and the Supreme Court's decision, delivered in January 2026, has now reversed an entire line of thinking and reshaped the legal landscape. The Supreme Court upheld the AAR's original view that the structure was prima facie designed for the avoidance of tax, and expressly set aside the High Court's decision that had exempted Tiger Global from capital gains tax. In doing so, the court ruled that the gains on the Flipkart exit are taxable in India under the Income Tax Act, even though Tiger Global had relied on what had traditionally been considered strong protections under the India-Mauritius Treaty. One of the most striking aspects of the Supreme Court's analysis was its treatment of the tax residency certificate. For decades, investors have taken comfort from the idea that if a foreign entity holds a statutory TRC from its home country, that certificate is sufficient, almost conclusive evidence that treaty benefits should apply. The Supreme Court, however, has now said that a TRC alone cannot preclude scrutiny of whether a foreign entity has genuine substance and independence in its home jurisdiction. This means that Indian tax authorities can look beyond a TRC to examine whether an entity really functions as a standalone business, or if it exists mainly to route income in a way that obtains treaty benefits without a genuine commercial purpose. Equally important is the court's treatment of grandfathering protections. The India-Mauritius Treaty had a clause that grandfathered certain exemptions for investments made before April 1, 2017. Tiger Global's entities had acquired interests in Flipkart well before that date, and argued that this grandfathering should protect the capital gains from Indian taxation. The Supreme Court, however, took a different view. It said that where a structure is prima facie engineered for tax avoidance and lacks independent commercial substance, the mere fact that investments were made prior to 2017 does not automatically cloak the transaction with protection against scrutiny under anti-avoidance principles. In other words, simply relying on grandfathering is no longer enough if the overall arrangement is viewed as an impermissible avoidance structure. Underlying this shift is the court's emphasis on what is now often described as the substance over form doctrine. When a transaction is structured in a way that, on its face, seems to exploit treaty provisions while lacking real economic reality, the court has said that anti-avoidance mechanisms, whether statutory like GAAR or judicial like a substance-based judicial review, can override treaty benefits.
This is a significant move away from the idea that treaty protections are sacrosanct or automatic, and it aligns with a global trend among tax courts to pierce purely form-based structures that have little substantive business rationale. Another key consequence of the Supreme Court's ruling is the reinforcement of India's sovereign right to tax income that is effectively connected to its economy. By holding that capital gains arising from the Flipkart sale are taxable in India, the court has underscored that sovereign taxation powers cannot be lightly set aside merely because of how an investor has chosen to route its investment or exit. This emphasis on economic nexus, the connection between the income and the Indian economic base, is likely to influence future litigation and structuring for transactions involving Indian assets. For foreign investors and private equity funds, the ruling closes a chapter that many had assumed was settled. For more than 2 decades, investment through Mauritius and similar treaty jurisdictions had been a staple feature of India-focused capital allocation, largely because treaty protection was interpreted generously. Today, investors will have to rethink those assumptions and deploy far greater diligence in ensuring that their offshore holding structures have real substance, independent operations, and clear business purposes beyond tax considerations. Otherwise, they risk having treaty benefits denied and significant taxes imposed, even if they hold formal certificates and comply with technical requirements. The ruling also has consequences for the wider investment ecosystem. Legal practitioners, tax advisors, and transactional lawyers will now place greater emphasis on documenting substance, board governance, decision-making autonomy, operational presence, and genuine economic activities in the treaty jurisdiction. Valuation methodologies, allocation of profits, and analysis of economic nexus will all take center stage in future disputes. Global investors, considering India deals, will have to recalibrate how they plan exits and structure capital commitments. From a policy standpoint, the Supreme Court's judgment sends a firm message that India will not be constrained by treaty entitlements when those entitlements are used in ways that undermine the domestic tax base through aggressive avoidance structures. At the same time, critics of the ruling note that the broad language around prima facie avoidance and jurisdictional denial of treaty access introduces new uncertainty and may deter some legitimate cross-border investments if not accompanied by clear administrative and legislative guidance. In conclusion, the Tiger Global judgment is far more than a dispute between a hedge fund and the tax department. It represents a turning point in India's international tax jurisprudence. It rejects the automatic sanctity of technical treaty protections in favor of a holistic assessment of economic substance and sovereign tax rights. It signals that simple form cannot trump economic reality, and that tax planning, no matter how smart, must be rooted in genuine commercial purposes. For investors, lawyers, policymakers, and students of tax law,
This judgment will be studied as a foundational text in understanding how India's courts balance treaty obligations with anti-avoidance imperatives.